presentation right now. No. Vortrag hochladen. Ja, sehr ausgefallen.
Doch, super, oder?
Ja, das wäre... Okay. Dauert noch zwei Minuten, weil die gerade noch eine Präsentation draufladen von der Selene Baez, aber dann fangen wir wieder an. Ja. You have it, Sim? Then we start with the other presentation, maybe.
¿Empezamos para avisar? ¿O esperamos?
No, aber... Too big? You have it?
¿Sí sale como enviado ya?
Yes, I think we start. We start, and maybe I can also give you a stick afterwards. I have one USB-C, and then you put. But maybe you let him know that you transferred on the stick in Spanish. Maybe it's easier.
Yeah.
But we start now with la presentación de Jörg Bendix. Sí. Yeah. Okay, welcome back after a hopefully relaxing lunch break to the afternoon session. This will comprise 3 talks and then presentations of a new book and a guide for determining seeds in the dry forest. And our first speaker is Jörg Bendix, who already mentioned that there is also some research on Galapagos Islands, and he will introduce the Darwin project to us. Jörg.
Okay, so that's me again, and I will follow up now with the triangle of DFG research of environmental collaborative ecosystem research in Ecuador, and I will now focus on the very small one. So that is a very small project which is called Darwin, and it's at the moment still really a climatological or meteorological project. So the title is Darwin, Dynamics of Precipitation in Transition, the water source for Galapagos Archipelago under climate change. You see here Darwin, and that is a collaboration between University of Marburg, Technical University of Berlin, and our colleagues from UNICOENCA, University of Azuay, Charles Darwin Foundation, and the Galapagos National Park. So we are now finishing this project. This has run 3 years almost, and I just will briefly go through some of the main results we could achieve there. So the question is why we started in Galapagos. Of course, everybody wants to go there, and also our federal president was there in the Humboldt University. But we thought in the beginning everything is researched, and that was a big mistake, because there is almost nothing known about the clear climatology and the meteorology we have learned. And there is one big general hypothesis that in climate change, so the archipelago is really threatened due to shortages of incoming cloud and rainwater. So that is very interesting. That was, of course, very interesting for us. And they say, especially in one season, which is normally dry and cool, so that could be a problem for the archipelago. And we learned, of course, that there is a huge knowledge gap. There are almost no data available and no data in space and time available. And that is very important, because the input is the freshwater source for this iconic ecosystem, and also, of course, for the people which are living there, including all these tourists on the cruise ships. And if you are looking onto the very simple classification of the islands, then you can see that the coast is normally relatively dry, so arid areas. And if you are going to the highland, so then you have a very moist zone. And that is, of course, the cloud forest, which has the water tower function for the archipelago. And there is nothing known so far. There was nothing known in atmospheric water input in space and time. And in Darwin, we have mainly analyzed rainfall, which means falling water droplets. But there's another source, I will come back to that later, which directly is related to the interaction of clouds and precipitation. That is cloud water interception. I will not talk too much about that, but that should be, from the hypothesis, very important. That is, if you have a cloud and the water is combed out by the vegetation, then you get a very high input of precipitation waters, as we note from cloud forest all over the world. Yeah, so just to give you some introductory figures, there's one INAMI station in Santa Cruz, Puerto Ayora, and the dry coastal areas. And normally, so we have 2 seasons there. The one season is the hot season, which is peaking in February to March, and the cool season, April to October. And if you're looking on the typical climate patterns, then you see, of course, the hot season has high temperature, it's warm. The cool season has cooler temperatures. And if you're looking into rainfall at this coastal station, which is obviously normally dry, then you see that in the hot season, you get more precipitation, and the cool season is obviously in the lower part really dry. And that is, of course, a critical season for water supply of the archipelago. So then we have, of course, to question what is going on with climate change. We don't have very good information. But what we also saw here a little bit in the Rio San Francisco is also a little bit evident in Galapagos. If you are looking on the mean temperature at this coastal site, you don't find a trend. Even if you are going to the maximum temperatures, that is what you see here, 1960s until today, then you see a light trend of increasing temperature. So the extremes seems to increase. But you have a high variability, and you see that the strong warm extremes are, of course, related to very strong El Nino events. And it's even more complicated if you're looking into the rainfall or the rainfall anomalies here. Then you can see that there is almost no trend, you can't see anything, but you see these big outliers, which are also the very strong ENSO events, which obviously brought a lot of heavy precipitation. So, but it's only one station. Nobody knows about the water balance and the water inputs of the entire archipelago, and also almost not of the highlands, of the most highlands. And so therefore, we wanted to try to analyze it in detail. And so our first question was, what is the spatiotemporal distribution of clouds and rain? So rain falling from higher clouds, or the cloud water here, from low stratus clouds, which are very often there in the cool season. And we wanted also to understand what happens during ENSO events, really with this precipitation, with this water inputs, comparing El Niño to La Niña effect. And then, of course, what are the forcing factors that we have changes maybe during ENSO? So that means global circulation pattern, but also regional circulation patterns in the area around. And here you have a nice photo. So that was a DFG calendar contest. Unfortunately, we were not selected, but that is our super site on Cerro Crocker, and we will come back later to that image. So because there is no data, we had a threefold approach here. And the first one is that we installed a network of automatic climate stations on the main islands, populated islands, from west to east, including an altitudinal gradient and also an exposition gradient on Santa Cruz Island. And you see already here some zonation. We have already seen the dry zone, the Garua zone, that is this drizzle precipitation for the cloud forests. And so on the highest island, Isabella, so it sticks a little bit out where we come back to a drier grassland. And so forcing factors are obviously sea surface temperature, SST, and you can see that is already complicated because we have on the eastern side, we have the influence of the Humboldt current, which is oscillating with the ENSO phenomenon, but on the western side, we have a very steady upwelling, so the cold equatorial undercurrent, which makes this SST pattern regionally relatively complicated. And so we have a large-scale forcing, which is also relevant for our area here. That is a South Pacific anticyclone, which provides a very continuous southerly airflow towards the archipelago. And also it is related to the so-called trade inversion, so that we have descending air parcels, which means that here we can't have convection in certain unstable stratifications, which means that clouds which are forming in this moist air are kept somehow by this inversion, especially in the cool season. So that's very interesting, and we wanted to know what is the forcing factors of that, and did some research on that. So, but we didn't want to do it only with a station network, because we wanted also to have spatial data and long time series of spatial data. So we also developed, based on the new GO satellite, retrieval for clouds and also for rainfall with 2 kilometer pixel resolution and 10-minute resolution, really high resolved. And secondly, we applied dynamical downscaling of a weather model, WOF, so where we also could also go back to the 80s to produce meteorological fields in 2 kilometer resolution as well, so we could compare it and hourly temporal resolution. So now I go a little bit into the results, just some highlights of the results. What we have seen here is the cloud frequency for the hot season and for the cool season at 2 different times, at 6 local time and 12 local time. And what you definitely see, it's very blue. That means in the cool season, which is normally the dry season at the coast, there is a lot of clouds, and that are mostly stratiform clouds. And if you are going then to 12 o'clock where everything is heated up a little bit, then you can see that in the windward side, so where you have this southerly stream flow, this very, very high cloud frequency remains. And that means that we have really high persisting cloud cover here on the windward side. And that is a little bit different on in the hot season. You see the cloud frequency is much lower, but the patterns are also quite different. So they are more convective and from all sides of the islands you see at the end precipitation. Very interesting, and that was also not known from the classifications which are tried in Galapagos, was if you are looking onto this pattern here, or cloud pattern, in Santa Cruz or on the other islands, you have a slight east-west shift. And this east-west shift we could explain with the model data, because there you see that you have the easterlies, which are continually waving from in the middle and upper troposphere. And if you have a cloud which is going into this area, then it will be shifted from east to west with the westerlies. So very interesting for climatologists, of course. And now then we compared the diurnal and the annual cloud frequencies and conducted the cluster analysis to get a zonation, a cloud zonation for the archipelago. You see, so that gave 9 different cloud types. It's more complex than thought before. And so the number 3 is the core area of these mountain cloud forest, and there are some transition zones and so forth. And so the question is, of course, what is going on with the cloudiness? And so there was one other station in the lower part of the cloud forest in Santa Cruz, and here you can see that the data say that is cloud coverage, not cloud frequency, that it looks like that in the hot season, the cloud coverage is reduced, but there is not that much in the signal at the moment for the cool season to see. So now that was the cloud, now we are looking into precipitation, which are delivered by the numerical model, and what you can see here is a different pattern. So that is relatively clear that in the warm season or in the hot season, you have the highest precipitation, because then we have convective activities, and in the cool season, with regard to falling precipitation, not cloud water interception, you see that the model has relatively low precipitation because it's mostly drizzle. But if you're also looking here to the comparison to our measurement data, then you see that obviously in the cloud forest the model is a little bit underestimating what we have measured. So very good for the justification of the model. Validation is that we also see this east-west shift also in precipitation fields. Rainfall needs clouds, of course, and that is very good, because here we can say, okay, we have a certain validation of the models also by our observational data. And then, of course, we had the luck, so that we exactly was measuring in a completely ENSO cycle. So you see here, there was in 2022, we had a La Nina. In 2023, we had an El Nino, and 2024 was a neutral year, so not too cold, not too hot. And what we have done in Santa Cruz is on the super side, you have seen that we have here a vertical pointing rain radar profiler. And that's a very interesting instrument, because you see here the average precipitation over the day along the altitudinal gradient. We can really look into the atmosphere 1,000 meters above the Cerro Croca, so we are at approximately 2,000 meters here. And you already see in the colors, there are different patterns. So in red means very strong precipitation in the hot season during ENSO, at least at the afternoon, so typical convective, strong convective system where obviously the inversion is disappearing, and also in the cool season where we normally have this cloud water. So you see that we have a shift towards light rain, that's not that much, but light rain, but over the entire profile. And the contrary is true, of course, for the cool area. You see here you have just precipitation drizzle in the lower parts, very close to the ground or really touching the ground, while in the hot season, so the precipitation is definitely clearly reduced over the entire height field. And that shows us, so that's still a hypothesis which has to be tested, but that shows us that the stratus clouds, which would be also available for cloud water interception, is uplifted because it's warmer and we get more convection, and the inversion, trait inversion, is weakened. And that could be, of course, a problem for the water supply in the cool season if the world would be warmer with regard to more El Nino effects. Yeah, and we checked that, of course, with other data. If we found also arguments for that here, that is the cloud statistics, in this case of convective clouds for this 3 years for the cool season. And you can see here the higher colors means that we have a higher convective cloud frequency, that the convective cloud frequency is much enhanced in this warm season than in the cool season compared. And that also is a hint so that we maybe have this uplifting of the Pacific stratus. So then with the model, we were able also to look into the atmospheric water balance of more than 30 years, 40 years, you see, 1980 to 2020. So where we separated all the years into Nino years, El Nino, La Nina, and neutral years. But here we use the ONI index, that is a typical El Nino index, which is calculated in the Central Pacific. So we are in the Eastern Pacific with Galapagos, just to say it. And what we see here, so the model says so that in the water balance we have the most water in El Nino regions, but also in the higher parts, and even a little bit more in La Nina compared to the neutral system. But also the model is not calculating cloud water interception so far. So this component is really still missing. Yeah, and we found out that these Nino definitions, where you use the sea surface temperature at the Central Pacific, not really are always very explaining our strong precipitation event. I cannot go here too much into detail, but we compared so the heavy rainfall events of the years with the relation to the ONI, so the official El Nino index, and we developed a known one, which is locally, the local domain around the Galapagos Islands, which is called GRENI, Galapagos Regional Nino Index, and we can see that we have here a much better relation, which means, yes, we have an influence of this really Pacific-wide ENSO, but mostly we have a big modulation of the regional changes in sea surface temperature. So let us look into the next forcing factor. So SST was the first one. The second one is, of course, the trait inversion I showed you, where the hypothesis is, of course, if we have El Nino, so this inversion is weakened and or disappearing and uplifted, so that also the cloud can uplift, which is needed for cloud water interception. And yes, you exactly see it. So we have analyzed all the temperature inversion data from the GOES 16 sounder. That's also a satellite instrument. And what you really can see here for the 3 years, that so the inversion in strength and altitude and whatsoever is weakened during this El Nino warm situation and uplifted, so that we obviously will have less clouds touching the ground. And the contrary is true for La Nina, where we have definitely a strengthened inversion, which is also lying a little bit lower, so that we can expect that we have more clouds there which are touching the ground. Yeah, so that is in very short all what I wanted to tell you about our results here So we have really developed a new high-resolution area-wide data set, and we have established for the first time a station network to study cloud and rainfall in the Galapagos. So we have seen that we have a very high cloud frequency, especially in the cool season, which brings then these cloud water interception, Garua. We cannot quantify that, which is very important. And we also found this interesting for meteorologists, an east-west shift pattern, which are showing that it's not only the ground flow which is important, but also the flow in the mid and higher atmosphere. And of course, warm El Nino extremes. If we are looking onto the falling precipitation at the moment, we would say more rainfall is coming into the system. That's what the model is saying, and we have seen that local SST, sea surface temperature, is very important to modulate the strength and the frequency of heavy rainfall events. But the problem we really have is in the cool season that we have this shift to light rain, the uplift of the low stratus, which is not anymore covering the ground. And so the hypothesis now is that we have, of course, then a failure of cloud water interception, and that would be a huge problem for this archipelago. So, but at the moment, at the end of the Darwin project, our atmospheric water balance is not complete. So we have to go now for the question how vegetation, epiphytes, trees or whatsoever interact really with the atmospheric conditions. And so the importance I just can show you here. Again, our major station where we measure precipitation and also cloud water flux. You have already seen, I guess, these instruments in the forest, or some of you. And the cloud water flux is not cloud water interception, but it's a good indicator. So that's a horizontal flux which is coming into the system. And what you can see here is the 1 year that is a La Nina year, so where we have obviously more of these clouds expecting. And you can see that is a drizzle which is falling onto the ground, and that is a fog water flux which is measured at this fog water instrument, which is corrected, of course, by drizzle precipitation, which is also partly captured. And you see the amount is 8 times higher. So here you see already the potential, and in the Hawaii Islands, so there are a little bit more analysis, and they say in the annual water balance it should be 30 to 40%. But we don't have data and we don't have area-wide data, so that's a problem. And to study that in more detail, I hope so that we can launch a new program, because Darwin is now expiring, which would be called Garua, where we can really analyze this interaction of vegetation, epiphytic vegetation, and the water balance to close this very important gap, which we at the moment still have. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jörg, for showing us the importance of fog for also water balances and ecosystem service provision. And now we switch back to the continent and go to the north, to the Chocó, where Nico Blütgen will introduce us to the research unit reassembly, where I'm also part of, happy to be also in this very different ecosystems, and I'm sure everyone is very excited to learn how species interact and rewire, and whether these systems are also similarly resistant or resilient to global climate change in comparison to these ones.
Thank you so much, Nina. Also, for respect and the audience and whatever, to invite and host me here. Although I'm representing sort of the northwestern part of Ecuador with our research, I've learned so much actually just being here over the last days. So first time, for example, I was in the field here with the Potocapos National Park, amazing. But also from today, from all the reports from Respect, I have a lot of respect for Respect. So this is absolutely amazing what you've achieved really over the last 30 years, but also over the last decade. This is a very young project. It has started 4 years ago. Now we are in our second phase, no, last phase maybe. So we just got refunded for another 4 years now. And we will have a kick-off meeting. That's what Nina just mentioned. So we're going to Quito then tomorrow to start this kick-off meeting on Friday. Yeah, so it's also a large project, right? So we are lucky that DFG funds us very well with this research, including a lot of professors from several German institutions, but also from Ecuadorian institutions that are participating in this program. So we also, like in the first phase, there were 13 PhD candidates or postdocs funded from both countries, but also from other countries, some externally funded ones. So we have staff on site that was funded. We have an advisory board. Now we have Mercator Fellows that advise us in addition. Now phase 2, we have even more colleagues that joined us from both countries. And we are again funded for 13 PhD candidates and postdocs. So they will all start next week. Yeah, and the overall framework is, well, what everybody knows. So we have this huge biodiversity decline. We are in an area of biodiversity crisis. And historically, biodiversity has been like much more widespread and much higher, much more pronounced in all the countries globally. So we saw this decline. And we are sort of at the turning point here in many regions. There are some attempts to restore biodiversity. Other regions will just drop further and further. And the question is, can we actually reverse biodiversity losses with natural regeneration? So that's what I will focus on, natural recovery. So there's no management. It is just agriculture that turns into forest automatically, what we are talking about. So the context, also we are an ecosystem restoration area of a decade of the UN, the United Nations. So we're in the middle of it now. What we want to study is species composition and biodiversity, interaction networks and ecosystem processes, and how they recover after disturbance. And I should mention Martin Schäfer was imperial really and essential for this whole project, because Martin Schäfer, maybe some of you will know him. He's the head of Foundation Tokotoko. They are hosting us there, and they're an amazing collaborator for us. So without them, it would not be possible what we're talking about here now. So this was in the very beginning when we designed the project. We also have a nice research station, and everyone is welcome to use it. So it's not even funded by DFG in this case. It was funded by an anonymous donor from the United States, I think, but I don't know the name of that person that funded like a whole research lab that we are now using. And we equipped the lab from the inside also, and it's very nice. This was in the early stage where it was very empty. And as Jörg also showed on the map, we are in the northwestern part of Ecuador, so on the Choco, in the Choco biosphere. Okay, so what we're doing is, because we don't have like 30 years of funding now, we look in space what happens in time, right? So we look at different successions of forest. We look at extensive pastures, for example. This is one of our plots. And then if you go 20 years later, after the pasture was abundant, you're in the middle of a forest. So this is how the forest looks like automatically after it was abundant as a pasture. So we have a lot of plots, 62 in total, that represent all these different stages. So we have active cacao plantation, active pastures, then 1 or a few year old secondary forests that recover naturally, up to almost 40 years now, and old growth forests that were never touched as our reference state to compare with. And a large number of plots. Most PhD students hate me for that because it was very, very intensive. So you have to walk a lot, for example, to get to all the plots and do a lot of work. But it's really worth it. So we have a nice design. On the right-hand side, you see all the walking trails. And one of them is only a road. The rest you have to walk. And they are nicely scattered in a larger landscape of about 14 kilometers in size. The research station is somewhere in the middle. And then we can always look at, okay, what on the x-axis in the following graphs, you always see the different ages of these plots. So how old are the secondary forests, or are they old growth forests? That means the age is infinity. And whatever we look at on the y-axis, I will explain then in a second. So we look at species composition, interaction networks, and ecosystem processes, but I will focus only on species composition here because that's That's the attribute of an ecosystem for which we have the most information so far. So we can distinguish whatever is left in the agricultural phase and then look at the recovery of all the attributes that come back. And many of the attributes you will see, they come back to the original state that has been the old growth forest before. So we can sort of separate resistance and recuperate, or resilience, which means the recovery of attributes of ecosystems. For example, start with trees. So apart from biomass, you see this more or less linear increase of biomass of trees that comes back, which does not reach the level, though, of old growth forest yet. After 36 years, for example, the projection is it will probably need 120 years to recover fully, like in terms of biomass of trees. The number of tree species recovers quicker than just the biomass, for example, but it still doesn't reach the full level. And then, obviously, we are all a bunch of zoologists, so also in comparison to respect, most of our colleagues are zoologists, so we study different types of animals. And why are we doing that? Because they play a very essential role in the recovery of forest. First of all, obviously, trees and other plants have to be pollinated, and almost over 90% of the trees, for example, need animals as pollinators. This is different also from temperate zone forests, for example, where only a much smaller fraction of trees are pollinated by animals. So most trees really, and we're talking about hundreds of species, they all require pollinators. They also require frugivores or seed dispersers, could be birds or bats that play a very prominent role here. And again, over 90% require these. And many of them will also transport the seeds outside of the forest. For example, if they forage there, they will deposit these seeds and then that later then germinate. There's another component that comes in that are sort of my favorite topic. These are dung beetles, because they are secondary dispersers. They bury the dung of mammals particularly, and then bury also the seeds inside the dung. This is like gardening, so they also help a lot in forest recovery. And then you see the germination of seedlings, which could be obviously altered by seedling predators or seed predators. So, and we also look at the different parts of the food web, for example, predator-prey interactions, different litter or deadwood decomposers, and so forth. So all these different elements represent different sub-projects in our research unit. And again, animals play a key role in forest regeneration. Then, obviously, the composition of the animal communities changes a lot. So we have many species that only occur in the early stages. These are called pioneers here. So if we just look at the distribution along our chronosequence, we can identify pioneers that are mainly occurring or have much higher abundances in the early stages, and then we have a lot of climax species that come back very, very late, and some of them even are restricted to the old growth forest, and then some intermediates as well. So it's this very, very strong turnover in species composition. Beyond that, like for example, the diversity or the number of species doesn't change a lot. The composition changes much stronger, for example, than just the composition, than the diversity. And this reflects for some of the species where we know where they come from, like if they're habitat generalists, for example, in terms of mammals or forests. This reflects very well what we know from the literature, also in terms of birds, where we find them in these habitats. But for most of the taxa, just be aware of it, there's no literature, right? There's no knowledge where they're typically occurring other than birds and mammals. So we don't know where bacteria would occur, or moths, or nocturnal insects. Most of the species, we know nothing about it. With this simple method, we can easily see if they are climax or pioneer species. Then obviously not only the composition changed, but also like the phylogenetic composition. This is also something in the paper just came out 2 days ago. So we can see if the phylogenetic structure or diversity changes along the chronosequence. And there's, well, the overall message is it's very taxon specific. Some taxa don't respond very well. Other taxa converge, so this means that species are closer related in old growth forests than in agricultural sites. And for frugivorous birds, we see the opposite pattern. And then, well, this is sort of a summary of so many PhD students that work. Lots of laboratories work, and if you're interested in some of these taxa, there's a lot of individual papers that describe very much in detail how the communities changes and what are the driving mechanisms behind this. This is a very quick summary of all these taxa that we studied. What we see is an overarching trend in terms of species composition. Most taxa recover, right? Except the first three. So for example, bacteria, for example, in the soil, they don't recover. They stay at the same level as the disturbed sites. Same with leaf litter arthropods, which are not very mobile organisms, so they cannot possibly reach the forest that is then growing back. All other mobile taxa, at least, are coming back at different speed of recovery. And again, this is not only species richness, it's composition, and some of the recovery is more or less complete. We can also look at the different trajectories, which we call legacy effects, because we are talking about secondary forests from pastures and from cacao plantations. Obviously, often what you see is that the cacao plantations have an advantage because the trees were left there. Trees and foliage and whatever was there. For other trees, this may be a disadvantage, but for many animals that like the forest, they also come back. And this is, again, the composition of forest species that are typically for old growth forests. So they all fully recover, but there are different scenarios. So for example, the trees, right? There's absolutely no resistance because all the trees were cut down. There's very few that remain on site. But they do recover more or less from zero and don't reach the full extent of composition. So what we have is here a very low resistance and a very low recovery rate. The opposite, for example, is a very high resistance, so it's not even disturbed a lot, and a high recovery rate. And guess what? It is bats, for example, that are foraging very, very, very widely over the landscape. So their disturbance effect is not very strong, and they recover very quick. And then, for example, dung beetles, they also go very low in terms of species composition at least, but then they also recover. So they have a low resistance, high recovery rate, and we have other systems where the trajectory shows high resistance and a low recovery rate. And if you just plot them all together, we see there are different system responses according to their level of resistance and return rate or resilience. So luckily, this is also like a joint effort of the whole team. So everybody is on the paper that comes out, hopefully in a few weeks. We're just waiting whether we get the cover of Nature, so it's not really clear yet. But I sent them a lot of jaguars and pumas, so maybe we also end up on the cover. Okay, if we just look at the recovery time, so how long does it take to recover fully to the same community that is not distinguishable from an old growth forest? As I said initially, species composition takes 100 years for trees. Species diversity, for example, richness, takes slightly less. And just the abundance of, just the number of trees, for example, recovers in maybe 20 years. But trees are very slow. Many of the animals are much faster to recover in terms of community composition, except for a few taxa that are slower than trees. And again, many of these taxa that respond very quickly are the drivers of the recovery of trees. So be them pollinators of fruit dispersers. So the mutualists of the trees are already there when the trees come back. Okay, so this is, if you want, a very optimistic scenario that we see here, right? So this is a graph that Martin Schäfer was painting after the initial graph that I've shown you. So this, for most of the taxa, we can fairly say that after 30 years, for example, we get between 80 and 90 years of the recovery of the diversity. Again, this is an optimistic scenario because much of the tropical landscape is not small-scale agriculture, which I will show you in a minute. It's large-scale agriculture, industrial agriculture, and then you can wait hundreds of years for communities to come back. So are local biodiversity losses reversible in natural regeneration? Yes. But again, this is, for example, a scenario that's very typical here. We see a fresh clear cut, which is now like a new cacao plantation, and the older forests and some old secondary forests are just in the surrounding, because our landscape is dominated by forests. So we've like total areas 3/4 of forest cover. So it's more forest than agriculture. So in this mosaic-like scenario, obviously this is the main force behind this very fast recovery, because at least the mobile species can always come from a nearby forest to recruit into the disturbed areas. So now we have the next 4 years of funding. What we want to do now, I haven't shown any network results yet because of the lack of time. But what we want to do in the next phase is we look at the different layers that are interacting, and we're enforcing these multi-layer networks by planting 16 different species of tree in every plot. So this is growing now, and we can use it now for the next 4 years. So what we have is a selection of pioneer tree species and climax tree species. They're all growing together in an experiment, and we see all the associations on these trees. That's why we can combine all these different zoological taxa and their responses to different tree species. And obviously the traits of these plants matter, also how they respond and how they grow, obviously in these different phases of the chronosequence. And we want to understand it in more detail, really like the functional ecology of these associations. But obviously, our main guiding question is still the same. We have different plots of different age. So we see how these multi-layer networks will recover. And then we're also going more experimentally. For example, what are the main biotic drivers? We can exclude birds, bats, and ants, for example, to study their importance on the tree associations by just exclusion experiments. And then something we also learned from respect, climate is important, also microclimate is very important. This is a study that also just came out from our study plots. Obviously, it's like what you expect. And old-growth forests have a certain temperature, for example. So this is the 0 level here. And then the more open the forest is, like pastures and cacao plantations, are up to 4 or 5 degrees hotter in 2 meters elevation, right? So it's like you have much more pronounced variability of climate, of diel cycles of climate, for example. So the buffering of the forest comes in after maybe 20 years. You see this buffering effect. But in the early secondary forest, you still have like these strong fluctuations of climate, in particular the peaks of drought and on the soil and temperature maxima. This is what we want to study in more detail. We will also put rainout shelters in there to experimentally control the precipitation. We look at the shade effects of remnant trees, for example, that are very, very important in this recovery. And we want to understand also the traits of the species that allow them to tolerate heat and tolerate drought, both for plants and for many animals. So we want to mechanistically understand who responds to microclimate variation. Yeah, that's all. So I have to really thank a lot, particularly the DFG, where we're here. So we're very well funded, so thank you very much. Also for Foundation Hokotoko, who played like a crucial role in like all the things that we are doing. Many of the institutions in Ecuador that supported us so well, many, particularly, so we have one collaboration with Cuenca, but we have many collaborations with colleagues in Quito, and maybe some of you are also interested to join us. So we're open, and we would like to collaborate with even more people. I think I've recruited even 3 more while being here. I particularly also have to thank the local people, because they supported us also a lot. There were many very fruitful interactions. And if you want to learn more, you can also just ask me later or look at our homepage, where we hopefully informative also what's going on in the Choco rainforest. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Nico, for sharing these exciting insights on how the positive side on recovery and restoration could look like, even passively, in such a landscape with a high percentage of forest cover left. We stay with restoration and also with functional ecology, so it was a perfect transition to Selene Baez's talk, who came here from, from Quito and will give us insights into restoration in mountain forests. And while the presentation is loaded, I maybe hand over to you, because we had some technical problems in transferring this via email, I don't know, but now I think it's almost loaded and we can start. The floor is yours. You stay there?
¿Con cuál? ¿Con este le pasa? ¿Y es el puntero? Sí, este puntito. Sí. El micrófono 2, ¿le activas por favor? Micrófono 2, ya, listo.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today, and thank you very, very much to the people organizing this event. So today I'm going to present a series of efforts we are conducting toward linking functional ecology to montane forest restoration in a few places in Ecuador. So we all know, I think, that the tropical Andes biodiversity hotspots is very special. It's considered one of the very important epicenters of biodiversity of the planet. It only holds 2% of the territory of the planet, and it holds up to 85% of the species of vertebrates, 10% of the vascular plants. So it is really important, and many, many of the species that are there are not found anywhere else. So the other side of this coin, of this huge biodiversity in these areas, is that it is also being degraded at very, very high rates. So there is lots of humans living in these landscapes, and you can see this is a picture of, interandean moist forests that are really rare to find now in Ecuador. And you can see that there is fire, that there is agricultural expansion, there is cattle ranching, there is mining, there are urban expansion, so there are many pressures in these ecosystems. At the same time, we find that the pressure under these ecosystems is not uniform, that it varies along altitudinal gradients. So for instance, here we can see that in this study, they found that most forest is being lost at lower elevation belts. Whereas at some higher elevation belts, there is even increasing in forest cover, that there is more natural forest regenerating, but there are also other land uses that are considered forest cover, like pine plantations, eucalyptus plantations, cocoa plantations. And this is really the focus of our interest now, is what is going on with all these areas that are not useful for agriculture, for cattle ranching. And so what is happening with these areas? Can we do something to enhance this restoration, this regeneration processes in these areas? And I also wanted to show you information from this study that is a rather recent study focusing on the trajectories of recovery of Andean forests, of tropical Andean forests. And you can see here, this is the desirable state where land is abandoned and it can be colonized by trees and eventually become a forest, a mature, diverse forest over time. But you can see that only a small fraction of this abandoned land is going through that trajectory, is taking that regeneration path. But most of the abandoned land here is going to disrupted recovery, to not recovery at all, or to arrested recovery. All these are alternative states that do not lead to biodiversity recovery or ecosystem service recovery. So what can we do in these areas to promote regeneration? As Nico explained in his presentation, that was very nice, by the way, there are several factors that affect what is going to be the regeneration pathway of a forest. And among them are landscape attributes, whether an abandoned land area is near or far natural forest that can determine how fast it will recover. There are site-scale features like forest, like soil conditions, land use legacies. What are the species that were planted there? What was it used for? Also the restoration strategies, whereas there is actually some restoration strategy, or it is left to regenerate on its own. And of course, now the main player in forest restoration, that is climate change. What do we want these ecosystems to be restored to under all the climatic pressures we are facing? So it is a complex, very complex issue, and that's probably why I like very much the title of this article, that tree planting is not a simple solution. It's not about going out there and planting whatever we can find and expect the forest to come back. Something that is key to mention is that we don't know much about how these regeneration processes take place. Here, there is a rather recent review of studies exploring regeneration or restoration in Andean forests. And you can see that there is almost a bit more than a handful of studies that explore regeneration for periods over 5 years. And the great majority of studies are only exploring regeneration with data taken over periods of less than 1 year. So here we have a huge gap of information before we can continue to try to do proper restoration practice. And in this graph, we have an idea of how restored or recovering ecosystems should change over time. And given this lack of information over large temporal scales, we are basically stuck at this part, at the maximum exploring how species diversity change, or with luck at how community composition change. But we are certainly very, very far away from understanding the recovery of species interactions, networks, and ecosystem functioning. So how do we link plant ecology to forest restoration practice in tropical Andean forest landscapes? Well, that's something that we are trying to do slowly but surely. And so we have started with my colleague and friend, Jimena Palomeque, and other colleagues from other universities. And we have now something that we can call restoration observatories. One is located here in the Andean Chocó Biosphere Reserve in the northwestern part of Ecuador, and the other one here in the southern Andes gradient, mostly in the Azuay province near Cuenca. And in these two sites, we have areas with active forest restoration, areas that have been planted, and the oldest ones have now 15 years, and we are doing the monitoring and looking at how it is regenerating the forest. We have passive forest restorations. We have reference ecosystems, natural forests near these areas, where we study how they are changing, what's the dynamics there. We have information on soil properties, on climate and microclimate, and more recently, we have in certain areas hydrological monitoring. So I would like to point to this picture here, that is Eva Tamargo, one of the persons that later went on to work with Nina, and she did the second monitoring of our restoration plots in the Chocó region. And here in this greenhouse, we have an idea of how many plants are produced in order to put in the field experiments where we evaluate plant performance. So here's some images about the work in the field. Here we have Gabriela Maldonado. Part of her doctoral work has been looking at natural regeneration and comparing it with the reference ecosystems. She also conducted this experiment that I consider that is very nice, because she used these circular plots, and she uses a key species that is Oreocales grandiflora. And she placed, so this is a treatment plot with the key species, and she has the control plots without this species. And this species is special because it has a kind of roots that improve very much the quality of the soil, so it is expected to help the other plants, and it is also highly important for hummingbird pollination. So over time, we expect that these treatment areas recover interactions, recover soil properties, and biodiversity overall in a faster fashion than plots that don't have these species. And here we have, this is a short video of what Franklin Marine did as part of his doctoral work. These are the experimental restoration plots that were established at 3 elevation areas near Cuenca. And he's exploring what are the effects of mowing and shade and elevation on the performance of species used for restoration. We are also using these sites for monitoring the natural regeneration to see how these treatments, either mowing, shading, or the combined effect is affecting the natural regeneration. And we have already seen that in the areas located at higher elevations, having this shading is really important. It does promote plant survival a lot. It is really helping to recover the vegetation in these sites. Here we have a picture of Dalma Orellana, who started recently at University of Ghent, and she is here working with the climatic monitoring sensors. And this is the most recent addition to our experiments. It is hydrological monitoring through the soil water plant systems under global change. That is an ARES-funded project. So we have here colleagues from my university in Quito and other universities establishing here the hydrological monitoring sites, and they are doing this in secondary forests, all secondary forests, and abandoned pastures to see how the hydrological cycle changes with forest regeneration. And there are people that say that the best is yet to come, and I want to believe that's true. So last year we were really honored to receive an Alumni Humboldt Award for innovative networking, and the team receiving this award is here, and of course you know me, most of you, but we are also including climate modeling and hydrology as a new line of research in our restoration observatories. And this is the name of our project, the Restoration Hub for Tropical Andean Ecosystems, linking science and practice, because we are hoping to use all this information to provide solid lines, solid information to policymakers and restoration practitioners, so all these efforts can be widespread. And to start wrapping up this, I invite you to see the videos that you can link through these QR codes. They are about these projects. And yeah, with that, I would like to thank to all our funding sources without which this would have not been possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Selene, for these insights into forest restoration projects. We now have 2 presentations. The first one will be given online. I hope this Zoom link is functioning. Where Erwin Beck will present from Bayreuth to Loja, the new, or the book on tropical dry forest, which has recently been translated to Spanish and is now kind of also available here for taking home later on. He's there. Erwin, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
And then?
Can you share your presentation?
Yes, I will try to do so. Can you see it?
Yes. It's not in full screen mode, but we
Yes,
can see
it will come. So
okay.
it's
Perfect.
fine.
Yeah, it's there. You can start.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings from Bayreuth University in the south of Germany. I'm very grateful to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this very important symposium via video. My colleague Franz Bogner, who was planned to join me in the presentation, is still on his way on the highway, and he asked me to pass on to you his apologies and regards. In the morning session, Jörg Bendix gave you a brief review of the history of the German Ecuadorian biodiversity and ecosystem research in South Ecuador and of the impressive achievements made over the past 30 years. As one of the initiators of this research in southern Ecuador, I feel compelled to express my personal appreciation and gratitude to so many people and organizations who were directly or indirectly involved in this research and to whom I owe a special debt of gratitude today. To the DFG as a main sponsor of the program, to the colleagues of our Ecuadorian partner universities in Loja and Cuenca, to NCI, which made the entire venture in Ecuador possible, and last not least, to the Ecuadorian governmental authorities, including INABIO and the German embassy in Ecuador. They all contributed to a fantastic success in knowledge gain and capacity building. The mentioned advances were achieved by countless, I would say by very numerous or countless scientists and students, German, Ecuadorian, and also from other countries, who have devoted themselves to research in common projects over 3 decades of years. They deserve our particular thanks. Having said this, let me now move on to the main topic of my presentation, the Spanish edition of our book on the biodiversity hotspot, tropical dry forests, the current research topic of respect. First, let me thank all authors of the chapters, and in particular also our Ecuadorian colleagues and friends for their assistance in translation and printing of the book. This book differs in the structure from its predecessor of the tropical mountain rainforests, as it begins with a detailed scientific introduction into this very specific ecosystem. It is about 55 pages long, so it is an extensive introduction. It covers the Earth history, geology, and soils. It covers the climate, the vegetation, the wildlife, mining, the research area of Laipuna itself, and several endeavors to protect this very endangered and unique ecosystem. The extensive references to this introduction are then followed by 8 chapters from the individual research projects working in the Reserva Laipuna. The chapter provided by the climate groups in Marburg and Cottbus deals with atmospheric energy flows and their interactions with the vegetation. With an index of greenness and vegetation density, they analyzed optical traits of the trees and forests with respect to energy use for photosynthetic carbon dioxide acquisition and biomass production. The chapter by the Wilke Group of the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology draws on the geological situation presented in the introduction and describes the specific weathering processes and soil development and soil properties in an area with a short rainy season and a long-lasting dry season. The chapter by Achim Breuning's group in Erlangen leads us into the interior of the tree stems and shows us the various anatomical structures of these trunks. In an approach from structure to function, the authors show how the wood anatomy can contribute to cope with severe drought stress during the prolonged dry season. Jürgen Hohmeier wrote a chapter on the vegetation. In addition to introducing the reader to the characteristic plant life forms and vegetation types, he presents a principal component analysis showing typical combinations of the characteristic traits of evergreens on the one hand and of deciduous trees on the other, which indicates how these plants differently respond to the short rainy and the long-lasting drought period. A very special and amply illustrated chapter by Franz Bogner reports on the life, the ecological importance, the human use, and the local myths surrounding the legendary cyber trees, which is typical of this area. Herbivory is an antagonist to plant biomass production because it not only removes biomass, but also consumes the productive leaf area, especially during the rainy season, when the leaves are sprouting and food for the herbivores is plentiful. The working group of Nina Fabik shows that arthropods, namely beetles and caterpillars, are the major groups of herbivores and how they can overcome the various lines of defense developed by the plants. Herbivory, on the other hand, is reduced by predators. Sorry, that's too fast. It's reduced by predators, which usually attack their prey at the larval stage. This attack can be quantified by using plastiline dummies, which can be seen here, of caterpillars. From the form of bites, Nina's group determined the groups of the attacking animals. Ants, crickets, and grasshoppers are much more effective predators than, for instance, the birds, which usually are considered as the main predators. Seed dispersal is an important factor for the persistence and functioning of an ecosystem, which is investigated by the group of Eike-Lena Neuschulz and Matthias Schleuning from the Leibniz Institute in Frankfurt. Various vectors, wind, water, and animals ensure effective seed dispersal. And the morphology of seeds and special chemical constituents of the fruits seem to be tailored to the respective vectors of dispersal. And they form particularly ecologically adapted seed dispersal syndromes. The book concludes with acknowledgements to the founder of NCI, Ivan Gayler, and its current and now living president, Matt Clark, and the Ecuadorian team of NCI, and give credits to the providers of the data and the photographs. The majority of the photographs were taken by Franz Bogner from the University of Bayreuth, who traveled twice in the dry and the rainy season to Lake Puna for this purpose. Another share of the photographs and illustrations was provided by the authors of the individual chapters. We hope that the book will be well received by an interested public and will find an enthusiastic readership. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Erwin, for this great overview of the Dry Forest book, now published in Spanish, and we stay in the dry forest. And now Lea and Jürgen will present, or Lea will present, I don't know, the seed guide that she did while doing, or is about to finish her PhD. Let's put it this way.
Thanks. Yeah, so thank you for still being around. I'm Lea, Jürgen is sitting over there, and we're very happy to launch our new field guide on the species of the tropical dry forest in and around the Laipuna Reserve today here. It looks like this. And this project we were able to do because of the funding of the Equal Opportunities Grant granted by our research unit. So we're very grateful for this. And it was published in December last year online. And the printed version, we have it since a few days, and it's available since today. There's very little information available for identification of plants in the dry forest still, and especially when we talk about seedlings. So we hope that this guide that we produced is going to be of help for researchers and also local people working in this dry forest, but also in others. So our guide includes 40 woody species that are very common in our research area. And we provide botanical descriptions and photographs of leaves and flowers, fruit, seeds, and seedlings. And the specialty, or something that was really important to us, is that the entire guide is bilingual. So it always gives the information both in Spanish and in English to make it available for a broader audience. So this is where this guide comes from, and this is where we work. You may have heard this earlier today if you've been around already. So we're talking about the Laipuna Reserve. You can barely see it. It's this black line showing the reserve borders. And it covers an altitudinal range of about 480 meters up to 1,500 meters above sea level. Yeah, it's bordered by the river Catamayo on one side. You see the scientific station here, and we have 3 villages close by with whom we've been collaborating extensively. And the forest we find there is semi-deciduous and deciduous tropical dry forest, which is affected very strongly by the strong seasonality that we find in the system. So most of the species shed their leaves during the dry season. So yeah, we mounted this picture together to make it very clear the sharp difference that you find between the 2 stations. And what I'm showing here, this graph, we're of course also including this in our guide. So we're having not such an extensive introduction as in the book of Beck and Bogner maybe, but we're also including an introduction to the research area and other things. So as one part of the introduction, we've been including information on the life cycle of plants because it's known to be very important for forest regeneration. So just to walk you through this quickly, when seeds are produced, they get dispersed by wind, gravity, or animals. And when they reach a new site and the environmental conditions are suitable, they will germinate into seedlings, which then eventually, hopefully, grow into saplings and recover into mature trees. And with the photographs from the field and the descriptions we provide, we try to cover all of these 4 stages of this life cycle. So we're trying to provide information on all of these. We illustrate this on for the individual species, but also here exemplary for Geoffroya spinosa. So you can nicely see like the development from the flower to the fruit, the seed, the emerging seedling, a larger seedling, and finally it's growing into saplings. And we think that this information on these several life stages that we provide can be very helpful for future investigation of restoration and regeneration of those forests. Yeah, this is how the individual species pages look like. So we include quite a lot of information, I think. So we give, of course, the scientific name, the name in Spanish that is used mostly by the local population. We have information on the general distribution, the habitat type the plant comes from, what type of growth form it is, and also we include icons to show how's that called? Yeah, if the species is threatened or not, and where you can find it within our research area, because we generally divide our research area in the lower and the upper elevation part. We have always 3 key characteristics that should be helpful for identifying the mature plant species, and then we provide botanical descriptions of the fruits, the seeds, and the seedlings, and also measurements of the size of the fruits and the seeds that we've been taking in the field, and information on the fruiting time, fruiting season, and the dispersal syndrome of the species. And most of this information that we're showing here, it comes from our own research time that we spent in the field, and also extensively from my colleague Andrea, who couldn't be here today. She did most of the measurements of the fruit and seeds, for example. But we also talked and collaborated a lot with the local population. So we're also, for example, providing information on how local people use these species. On the species pages, we show this as icons, but at the end of the guide, we also have this in written, more extensive form. To make this more accessible for also people that are not so deeply into botany, we include both a descriptive written, but also, as shown here, illustrated glossary, showing all the botanical terms that we use throughout our descriptions, both in English and in Spanish. And that's almost it. I just want to mention here and be very clear on this, that this is a great collaborative work. It's not only me or only Jürgen, but a lot of people that have been very much involved in this. For example, my direct colleague Andrea from the Senckenberg Institute, Diana Acosta, who did her PhD also here within the research unit, but now is working at the Kew Garden. Diana Fernandez from INABio here in Ecuador, who's been helping a lot. And also through the INABio, this guide was published. So this was really important for us. We had great help of Jose Acaro, the local forest guide, I would say, who's been part of this. And of course, my PIs, Matthias and Eike, and Jürgen, who did most of the taxonomic identification and checking that we were doing everything the right way. And if you are interested in this, you can follow this QR code to our Respect project website, where you can directly download it. It's freely available, free of charge. It's also on ResearchGate when you search for my name. And we have those in printed formats, which we will be giving out now in the poster session. So if you would like to have a printed version of this, please come find us at the poster, and we'll be happy to hand you one. And thanks.
Thanks very much, Lea. Now there's a short coffee break, and we are 10 minutes delayed, so maybe we extend the coffee break by 10 minutes and then start the poster session. And the poster session will follow that every one of the English posters gives a 2-minute, maximum 3-minute introduction in the poster, and we walk you through, or Balthasar will walk you through, and we'll take the time so that it doesn't take longer than the period that we have foreseen for that. And afterwards, we will have the annual report of NCI. And therewith, I want to thank all the speakers that were presented today, all the audience, of course, for listening to all this information, which was quite a lot and dense, I know that. But we always try to make use of these days to give most people the chance to also present their work. Thanks very much. Enjoy your coffee, and then see you next door for the seed guide and the posters.